The plane shook as it hit another pocket of turbulence. Dr. Elise Mitchell grabbed her armrest, took a deep breath, and tried to relax. After months of campaigning, knocking on doors, giving speeches, and shaking thousands of hands, she had won. In just 3 days, she would be sworn in as the new governor. But right now, dressed in her comfortable jeans and a simple sweater, that hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail, she looked like any other tired traveler. And that was exactly how she wanted it. These were her last few hours of normal life before the cameras, the security teams, and the weight of running a state would become her everyday reality. The plane bounced again. Elise shifted in her seat, trying to find a comfortable position in the cramped economy row. Across the aisle sat a white man in his 40s with a military-style haircut and broad shoulders that strained against his polo shirt. A badge peeked out from his carry-on bag. He had been talking loudly on his phone before takeoff about some police conference he'd attended. Another jolt of turbulence, stronger this time, and Elise's elbow slipped off the armrest, accidentally bumping against the man's arm. "Excuse me," she said politely. The man turned, his face immediately hardening when he looked at her. "Watch yourself," he snapped, his voice carrying through the cabin. "I apologized," Elise replied calmly. "It was just the turbulence." His eyes narrowed. "Yeah, well, maybe you people should be more careful, always taking up space that isn't yours." The words hung in the air like poison. A few passengers nearby looked up, then quickly looked away. Elise felt her heart rate quicken, but kept her expression neutral. After 20 years in public service, she knew this dance all too well. "I'm not sure what you mean by you people," she said quietly, "but we're all just trying to get home safely." The officer scoffed. "Don't play dumb with me. First, they let anyone vote. Now they let anyone fly in decent planes." He looked her up and down. "Bet you couldn't even afford this ticket without some handout." An older woman across the aisle gasped softly. A young man 2 rows up turned around, frowning, but said nothing. Elise straightened her back. "Sir, I—" "Don't sir me," he cut her off, his voice rising. "I work for a living. Protect people like you who don't appreciate it. 20 years on the force dealing with your neighborhoods." The flight attendant appeared at the end of the aisle, sensing trouble but still too far away to hear the specific words. "I think you should stop now," Elise said firmly. "You don't know anything about me." Something in her calm confidence seemed to enrage him further. His face flushed red. "I know enough," he snarled. Then, with deliberate slowness, he gathered something in his mouth and spat. The glob of saliva landed on the floor between them, but the intention was clear to everyone watching. Time seemed to freeze. Shock rippled through the nearby seats. A teenage girl diagonally behind Elise quietly raised her phone, recording. The flight attendant rushed forward. "Sir, that behavior is completely unacceptable." More crew members appeared. The officer leaned back in his seat, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Just clearing my throat. No law against that." "Ma'am, are you all right?" Another attendant asked Elise. "We have an empty seat in first class if you prefer to move." Elise nodded, gathering her small carry-on bag. As she stood, she caught the officer's eye one last time. "For the record," she said, her voice steady and clear enough for everyone nearby to hear, "I paid for my ticket with the same salary I've earned serving the public for 2 decades, just like you claim to do." She followed the attendant toward the front of the plane, her steps measured and dignified. Behind her, whispers spread from row to row. Several passengers were now openly filming. The officer still wore his satisfied smile, not realizing he had just created the biggest mistake of his career, or that in less than an hour, he would discover exactly who he had tried to humiliate. The first-class flight attendant guided Elise to an empty window seat, her face a mixture of concern and embarrassment. "I am so sorry about that, ma'am. Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee? Something stronger, perhaps?" Elise shook her head. "Just water, please." As the attendant walked away, Elise took out her phone, her hands trembling slightly despite her outward calm. 20 years in politics had taught her to wear a mask of composure, but inside, her stomach was in knots. She typed a quick message to her chief of staff, Thomas. "Incident on flight. Nothing serious, but might hit social. Will explain when I land." 3 rows behind her, a woman in a business suit leaned over. I saw what happened back there. I've got it all on video if you need it. Thank you, Elise said softly. I might. More passengers stopped by her seat as they used the bathroom, offering quiet words of support, telling her they had witnessed everything. One elderly man squeezed her shoulder as he passed. My wife and I are ashamed of how that man treated you. Not all of us are like that. Elise thanked them all with the same practiced smile she'd perfected during her campaign, but her mind was racing. This wasn't just about her now. In 3 days, she would take office. How she handled this would set the tone for her entire administration. Meanwhile, in economy class, Officer Robert Whittaker was feeling pretty good about himself. The flight attendants had moved the woman instead of him, proof in his mind that he was in the right. The young guy who'd been recording had put his phone away after a stern look. Some people need to learn their place, he muttered to the businessman beside him, seeking validation. The man gave him a cold stare. The only one who embarrassed himself here was you. Whittaker's satisfaction faltered. He looked around and noticed several passengers giving him disapproving glances. An older woman was whispering to her husband while pointing in his direction. His neck grew hot. Whatever, he grumbled, pulling out a magazine and pretending to read. As the plane began its descent, Elise's phone buzzed with messages from Thomas. Videos already circulating. Officer identified as Robert Whittaker, police lieutenant from North District. What do you want to do? Elise stared out the window at the approaching city, her city now. She typed back. Nothing. Regular arrival as planned. Sure? Press got wind. They're at the gate. She took a deep breath. Stick to schedule. This changes nothing. But it had changed something. Elise had spent her campaign talking about reforming systems of power, about accountability. Now the universe had dropped this test into her lap before she'd even taken the oath of office. The plane touched down with a gentle bump. As passengers prepared to disembark, Elise remained seated, letting first class empty around her. She straightened her sweater, pulled a blazer from her carry-on, and slipped it on. From her bag, she took a simple gold pin, her future officer's seal, and attached it to her lapel. The flight attendant who had helped her earlier noticed the pin, her eyes widening in recognition. Yo! Oh my goodness. Elise smiled. Thank you for your help today. I appreciate your professionalism. Near the back of the plane, Whittaker was gathering his things, still smarting from the cold shoulders he'd received during the flight. He had already forgotten the woman's face, filing the incident away as just another interaction where he put someone in their place. As he waited impatiently for the rows ahead to clear, his phone suddenly exploded with notifications. A fellow officer had texted, "Dude, tell me you didn't just harass the new governor on your flight." Whittaker froze, his blood turning cold. Another message from his sergeant, "Call me immediately." Then came the media alerts from the local news app he had installed. Governor-elect Mitchell arrives at airport amid reports of in-flight altercation with local police officer. The passengers around him were looking at their phones too, then looking at him, making the connection. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as the reality of what he had done, and who he had done it to, began to sink in. And 6 rows ahead, just visible through the crowd, he caught a glimpse of the woman he had spat at, now wearing a blazer, surrounded by people with cameras. Whittaker couldn't move. The crowd of passengers pushed past him, but he stood frozen, staring at his phone. The messages kept coming in, from fellow officers, friends, even his daughter. "Dad, please tell me that's not you in the video." Video? Someone had filmed it. Of course they had. His fingers fumbled with his phone, searching social media. There it was, already with thousands of views. Police officer harasses and spits at woman on flight. Turns out she's the new governor. The clip showed everything, his sneering face, his cruel words, the deliberate way he gathered saliva in his mouth. Worst of all, it captured her dignified response. In the harsh light of the tiny screen, he looked exactly like what he was, a bully. Up ahead, a small crowd had gathered at the gate. Whittaker finally forced himself to move, joining the slow shuffle of passengers exiting the plane. He kept his head down, hoping to slip past unnoticed. The jetway opened into a scene Whittaker wasn't prepared for. News cameras, airport security. A small welcome committee with flowers and a handmade sign, "Congratulations, Governor Mitchell." There she was, the woman from the plane, but transformed. Standing tall in her blazer, she looked nothing like the tired traveler he targeted. She radiated authority as she shook hands with the waiting officials. A tall man in a suit, clearly her chief of staff, whispered something in her ear, and her eyes briefly scanned the deplaning passengers. For a split second, she locked eyes with Whittaker. No triumph, no anger, just a steady gaze that seemed to look straight through him. Then she turned away, focusing on the reporter who had stepped forward with a microphone. "Governor-elect Mitchell, how does it feel to be home just days before your inauguration?" Her voice carried clearly across the terminal. "It's good to be back. I'm eager to get to work for all our citizens." "Governor, is it true there was an incident on your flight?" Another reporter called out. She paused, considering her words carefully. "Today I experienced what too many people in our state experience daily. It only strengthens my resolve to build a government that treats everyone with dignity." Whittaker tried to push past a family with luggage, desperate to escape before anyone recognized him. "That's him." The voice came from behind, another passenger from the flight. "That's the officer who spit at the governor." Heads turned, cameras swiveled. Whittaker froze in the harsh spotlight of public attention. "Lieutenant Whittaker." A reporter rushed toward him. "Do you have a comment about the incident on the plane?" More cameras, more questions. The terminal seemed to spin around him. "No comment," he mumbled, pushing past. Security guards who would normally nod in professional courtesy now stared at him with undisguised disgust. His phone rang. His captain. He let it go to voicemail. What could he possibly say? 20 feet away, Governor-elect Mitchell continued her impromptu press conference, handling questions with the ease of someone who belonged in leadership. "Will you be pressing charges against the officer?" a reporter asked. The crowd hushed, waiting for her answer. Whittaker stopped too, his future hanging on her next words. "This isn't about one incident or one person," she said. "It's about systems that allow such behavior to go unchecked. As governor, I'll focus on meaningful change, not personal vendettas." The reporters pressed for more, but her staff began moving her toward the exit. "The governor-elect has a full schedule today. Thank you." As her small entourage headed for the doors, Whittaker stood alone in the terminal, abandoned by fellow travelers, watching his career and reputation crumble with each new social media notification. His phone buzzed again with a text from his sergeant, "Administrative leave, effective immediately. Surrender your badge and weapon to the duty officer when you arrive." Outside, news vans were already setting up for evening broadcasts. Airport security approached him with uncomfortable expressions. "Sir, there's a lot of media interest. Would you like an escort to your vehicle?" Whittaker nodded numbly. The officer who'd once made others feel small now shrank into himself, hoping to become invisible as the full weight of his actions began to descend on him. By evening, the airport video had gone national. Every major news channel played the clip in an endless loop. Officer Whittaker's angry face, the shocking moment of the spit, Governor-elect Mitchell's dignified response. Each replay dug Whittaker deeper into a hole of his own making. Whittaker sat alone in his living room, blinds drawn, watching his life unravel on screen. His phone had been ringing nonstop until he finally turned it off. His daughter had texted that she was staying at a friend's house tonight. "I can't deal with this right now, Dad," she'd written. "How could you?" The police department had released a brief statement. "The officer in question has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. The department does not condone discriminatory behavior of any kind." Too little, too late, the public responded. Social media detectives had already uncovered 3 previous complaints against Whittaker, all filed by people of color, all mysteriously dismissed without action. Reporters were now digging into those cases, interviewing the complainants who finally felt someone might listen. Across town, in a hotel suite serving as a temporary office, Elise Mitchell finished her 3rd interview of the day. "Governor-elect, do you want Officer Whittaker fired?" the interviewer had asked. "What I want is a system where no one fears mistreatment based on how they look," she replied. "This isn't about punishment, it's about changing a culture that makes some officers believe they can act this way without consequences." Now, alone with her small team, Elise finally let her composed facade crack. "I'm tired," she admitted, sinking into a chair. 20 years in public service, and still. Thomas, her chief of staff, squeezed her shoulder. "You handled it perfectly. The polls are already showing a 5-point bump in your approval rating." She shook her head. "I don't care about the polls. I care about fixing what's broken." Her phone buzzed with a message from her sister. "You ok? Really ok?" For the first time since the incident, tears welled in her eyes. She wiped them away quickly, then typed back, "I will be." Meanwhile, at the North District Police Station, Captain Rivera faced a room full of angry officers. "This is a witch hunt," one shouted. "Whitaker's being railroaded because of politics." Rivera held up his hands. "I've reviewed the video. This isn't political. What he did was wrong, plain and simple." "So we're just throwing him under the bus?" Another officer challenged. An older officer in the back stood up. "I've known Bobby Whitaker for 15 years, and I've watched him treat people differently based on their skin color for 15 years. We all have." And we said nothing. He looked around the room. "That's why we're here now." The room fell silent. Across the city, people gathered in living rooms and bars, debating the incident. Outside the police headquarters, a small protest formed, people holding signs reading "Accountability and "No one above the law." At a diner near his home, Whitaker hunched over a cup of coffee, hat pulled low over his face. He'd finally had to leave the house. The reporters camped outside, the phone ringing endlessly. He needed to think, to figure out how to fix this. "More coffee?" the waitress asked, then paused, recognition dawning. "Wait, aren't you?" "Just the check, please," Whitaker mumbled. As he paid, the TV above the counter switched to news coverage of Governor-elect Mitchell's press conference. "Today's incident reflects larger issues we must address," she was saying. "When those entrusted with authority abuse their power, we must ask not just what that individual did wrong, but what systems allowed them to believe such behavior was acceptable." Whitaker watched, really seeing her for the first time, not as someone to dominate or dismiss, but as a leader with vision and compassion that he couldn't begin to understand. His phone buzzed with a text from his captain. "Press conference tomorrow, 9 a.m. Department announcing expanded investigation into past complaints. Call me back." Whitaker stared at the message, the walls of his carefully constructed world continuing to crumble around him. The truth he'd spent years avoiding was catching up, broadcast on every channel and social media platform for the world to see. There was nowhere left to hide. 3 days after the plane incident, Elise Mitchell raised her right hand and took the oath of office, becoming the state's first black female governor. The ceremony, planned months in advance, now carried extra weight. Every news outlet mentioned the incident. Every commentator analyzed her response. How she handled Whitaker had become a test of her leadership before she'd even begun. That evening, alone in the governor's mansion for the first time, Elise kicked off her shoes and sat by the window. The day's brave face gave way to exhaustion. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mother. "So proud of you, baby. Your father would have been too." Tears she'd been holding back finally came, not just about Whitaker, but about all the times before, the professor who suggested she wasn't cut out for law school, the client who requested someone else to handle his case, the voter who said he just couldn't picture her as governor. She allowed herself 5 minutes of tears. Then she wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and opened her laptop. She had work to do. Across town, Whitaker sat in his kitchen, surrounded by emptiness. His wife had left years ago. His daughter wasn't answering his calls. The department had extended his leave and scheduled a disciplinary hearing. Old complaints against him had been reopened, with investigators interviewing officers who'd worked with him. The worst part was the videos, not just from the plane, but others that had surfaced. Dashcam footage showing him being rougher with black suspects, body camera clips revealing his different tone with white and black drivers during traffic stops. Patterns he'd never acknowledged, laid bare for everyone to see. His doorbell rang. Whitaker ignored it, assuming it was another reporter. It rang again, more insistent. Through the peephole, he saw his daughter, Lisa, shifting nervously on the porch. He opened the door, relief washing over him. "Lisa, I'm so glad you—" "I'm not staying," she interrupted. "I came to say something." His heart sank. Come in, at least. She stepped inside but remained by the door. At 20, she looked so grown-up, so different from the little girl who once thought he hung the moon. I've been reading about what happened, she began. About the other complaints, too. Lisa, it's complicated. No, Dad, it's not. Her voice trembled. My best friend in college is black. Her father is a doctor. She showed me the video and asked if that was really my dad. Do you know how that felt? Whitaker stared at the floor. Growing up, you always told me to judge people by their character, not their color, Lisa continued. Was that just something you said? Because it looks like you've been doing exactly the opposite. I'm not. I don't think I'm, he couldn't finish. Racist, she supplied. Dad, I've heard the comments you make when you think no one's really listening. The jokes with your buddies. The way you talk about those neighborhoods. I always made excuses for you, not anymore. She pulled a folder from her bag. I brought you something. Inside was a printed registration for a 6-week community dialogue program on racial equity. It starts next Monday, she said. I've already paid for it. Go or don't go, that's your choice. But my choice is that I won't have a relationship with someone who treats people the way you treated the governor, or the way those other complaints said you've treated people for years. She turned to leave. Lisa, please, he said, his voice breaking. I don't know how to fix this. She paused at the door. That's why I brought you the folder, because maybe you can learn. After she left, Whitaker sat with the folder open on his kitchen table. The program description promised honest conversations about privilege, power, and racial justice. A month ago, he would have laughed at such things. Now, they were a lifeline to his relationship with his daughter. His phone buzzed with an email notification. The police union representative, hearing scheduled for next Tuesday. Recommendation for termination likely. Call to discuss options. Whitaker stared at the registration form, then at his phone. Everything he built, his identity, his career, his family's respect, was slipping away. For the first time, he considered that maybe he was the problem. 3 weeks into her term, Governor Mitchell sat in her office reviewing the final draft of her police reform initiative. The plane incident had pushed the issue to the top of her agenda, though she'd always planned to address it. Now she had public attention and momentum. The police unions are fighting back hard, Thomas said, placing another report on her desk. They're saying this is a personal vendetta because of what happened with Whitaker. Ellis sighed. We knew they would. But the data speaks for itself. Complaints up 40% over 5 years. Settlements costing taxpayers millions. And look at these numbers on racial disparities. She tapped the report. Her plan was comprehensive: civilian oversight boards, mandatory body cameras, funds redirected to community policing and mental health response teams. And something new: a restorative justice program bringing officers with misconduct records together with community members affected by police actions. Speaking of Whitaker, Thomas said carefully, his hearing is tomorrow. Word is they're firing him. Elise paused. Has he made any statements? Shown any understanding of what he did? Nothing public. Though I heard he enrolled in some kind of community dialogue program. She leaned back in her chair, an idea forming. Call Chief Reynolds. I want to try something. The next morning, Whitaker sat stiffly in a small conference room at police headquarters, waiting for his hearing to begin. His union representative had made it clear things looked bad. The best he could hope for was resigning before being fired. The door opened and Chief Reynolds entered with the department's legal counsel. There's been a change of plans, Reynolds said, his expression unreadable. The governor has requested your participation in a pilot program before any final decisions are made. Whitaker frowned. What kind of program? A restorative justice session. With her. Whitaker's stomach dropped. With the governor? Why would she want that? You'll have to ask her yourself. It's scheduled for 2 p.m. today at the community center downtown. Attendance is voluntary, but Reynolds let the implication hang in the air. This was Whitaker's only chance. At the community center, Whitaker arrived to find a simple room with chairs arranged in a circle. A woman introduced herself as the facilitator, explaining the process as other participants filtered in, community leaders, a police trainer, and 2 citizens who had filed complaints against officers. Then the room hushed as Governor Mitchell entered, without entourage or fanfare, dressed simply in a blazer and slacks. She nodded to each person, then took a seat directly across from Whitaker. "Thank you all for being here," the facilitator began. "This is a space for honest conversation about harm, accountability, and healing. We're here to listen and speak with respect." For the first hour, others shared their experiences. A pastor describing being stopped for driving while black, a teacher explaining how students of color viewed the police in her classroom. Whitaker shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. Then the facilitator turned to him. "Officer Whitaker, would you share what brought you here today?" He cleared his throat. "I'm here because I made a mistake." "A mistake is forgetting your keys," the facilitator corrected gently. "What happened on that plane was a choice." Whitaker felt heat rise in his face, the familiar anger when challenged. He glanced at Governor Mitchell, who watched him steadily, her expression neither angry nor sympathetic, just present, waiting. He began, then stopped. The room was silent. "I treated the governor with disrespect. I used language that was racist, and I did it because I could, because I thought there would be no consequences." "And why did you think that?" the facilitator asked. "Because there never had been before," he admitted, the truth finally forcing its way out. "In 20 years on the force, no one ever called me on it. Not my fellow officers, not my supervisors. I got complaints, but they all disappeared." He looked directly at Governor Mitchell. "What I did to you on that plane, it wasn't the first time. It was just the first time I couldn't walk away from it." The governor leaned forward slightly. "Officer Whitaker, I didn't arrange this meeting to punish you further. I arranged it because what happened between us is happening across our state every day. And if we're going to fix it, we need to understand it." She gestured to the circle. "That's why we're all here. Not for easy answers or quick forgiveness, but for the hard work of real change." Whitaker nodded slowly, something shifting inside him as he prepared to truly listen for perhaps the first time in his career. 6 months later, the state capitol building buzzed with activity. Reporters and photographers lined the steps, waiting for the ceremony to begin. Today, Governor Mitchell would sign the Comprehensive Police Accountability Act, legislation that had seemed impossible just a year earlier. Inside, the governor checked her reflection in her office bathroom mirror. The bags under her eyes told the story of late nights and hard-fought compromises to get the bill passed. Worth every sleepless hour, she thought. A knock at the door. Thomas poked his head in. "They're ready for you, Governor." She smoothed her jacket and followed him to the Capitol Rotunda where a crowd had gathered. Police chiefs stood alongside community activists. Legislators chatted with citizens who had shared their stories of mistreatment at committee hearings. And in the back, almost hidden by a pillar, stood Robert Whitaker. He looked different now, thinner, less imposing without his uniform. After that first restorative justice session, he had continued with the program, eventually becoming a regular participant. His police career was over. He had resigned rather than face termination, but he had found a new path. The crowd quieted as Governor Mitchell approached the podium. Cameras flashed as she surveyed the room. 6 months ago, I stood before you as your new governor and promised change, she began. Today, we take a significant step toward fulfilling that promise. She outlined the law's key provisions: independent review of excessive force complaints, mandatory body cameras with public access to footage, reallocation of funds to mental health crisis teams, and comprehensive anti-bias training. But laws alone cannot heal wounds or build trust, she continued. Those require human connection and ongoing commitment to do better. She gestured to a woman in the front row. I want to thank Linda Cooper, who leads our new Community Safety Advisory Board, for her tireless work bringing citizens and officers together. Linda stood, acknowledging the applause. Beside her was her son, who had been wrongfully detained by police 2 years earlier. Their story had moved many legislators to support the bill. I also want to acknowledge someone whose journey represents the difficult but necessary work of true accountability. All heads turned as she looked toward the back of the room. Robert Whitaker, former police lieutenant, now serves as a civilian liaison to our Police Oversight Committee, sharing insights from his 20 years on the force and his recent journey of personal change. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Many knew the story. how the man who had spit at the governor now worked with her administration. Some called it a publicity stunt, others a powerful example of restorative justice in action. Whittaker nodded slightly, uncomfortable with the attention but accepting it as part of his path. After the ceremony, he stood awkwardly at the reception, a cup of untouched punch in his hand. His daughter Lisa had come with him but was chatting with a group of young activists across the room. "Mr. Whittaker." He turned to find Governor Mitchell beside him. "Governor," he said, his voice catching. "Congratulations on the bill." "Thank you for your contributions to it," she replied. "The insights from your community dialogues were valuable." An uncomfortable silence fell between them. 6 months of working toward the same goal had not erased what happened on that plane. "My daughter is proud of me today," he said finally. "First time in a long while. I never thought I'd be standing here." The governor nodded. "Change is rarely comfortable, Mr. Whittaker, but it is always possible." A staff member approached, needing the governor's attention. Before leaving, she looked at him one more time. "We're not friends, Mr. Whittaker. We probably never will be. But we're both serving something larger than ourselves now. That's what matters." As she walked away, Whittaker caught his daughter watching from across the room. She gave him a small smile and a thumbs up. Outside the Capitol, protesters still gathered, some saying the law went too far, others arguing it didn't go far enough. The work was far from finished. But inside, Whittaker understood what the governor meant. This wasn't about personal redemption or simple forgiveness. It was about using their shared experience, painful as it was, to create something better for others. He set down his punch cup and walked toward the community activists his daughter was speaking with. There was more listening to do, more learning ahead. The journey that began with an act of hatred had somehow led him to a place of purpose.